thought my wedding day would be perfect. Until I realized someone wanted me dead. The morning began like every fairy tale I'd imagined. The sunlight poured through the hotel suite, hitting the silk drapes and warming the ivory roses scattered across the room. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the lace on my gown, telling myself it was excitement. My reflection stared back from the mirror, pale and nervous, yet smiling like a practiced actress. Today was supposed to be unforgettable, yet an uneasy tension settled in my chest. Liam, my husband, wandered through the suite, laughing with the groomsmen over something trivial. His joy was contagious. He had no idea the storm waiting for him and me was already in motion. I tried to let the moment carry me, letting the music from the lobby seep through the walls. It was comforting, but beneath the noise, I sensed something I had been anticipating for 2 years. Eleanor. She hovered at the edge of the crowd, perfectly poised, every movement deliberate. Her eyes flicked to me briefly, a shadow crossing them I had learned to read. It was subtle, but it was there, a quiet malice carefully concealed behind polite smiles. She approached the champagne table, where glasses sparkled under the chandelier, her movements slow and calculated. She had spent years undermining me, shaping every event, every interaction to belittle, exclude, and control. And now, it seemed, she had escalated beyond words. I watched as she reached into her clutch, her fingers brushing against something small and glassy. My stomach clenched, but my breath stayed calm. Panic would have been a mistake. She thrived on chaos, on the reaction of her victims. I had learned to keep my face neutral, my hands steady. My life had depended on it, quietly surviving a subtle war that had raged for years. She poured. A small, nearly invisible stream of liquid disappeared into the flute. I didn't flinch. I simply let my mind calculate the consequences. My glass, her glass, the distance between us, and the guests oblivious to the danger that had entered their celebration. I switched the glasses slowly, deliberately, every gesture hidden within the motions of adjusting my veil. It was subtle, unnoticed, perfectly concealed. The band shifted to a soft, melodic tune. The guests swayed in polite rhythm, laughing and clinking glasses. I held my own champagne, eyes tracking Eleanor as she raised her glass for a toast. Every movement she made was deliberate, rehearsed. The smiles and applause filled the hall, yet I felt like I existed in a suspended bubble, seeing the threat clearly while the rest of the world remained oblivious. It wasn't the first time she had tried to ruin me. Over the past 2 years, every attempt had been smaller but equally insidious. She had mocked my career achievements, questioned my choices in front of family and friends, and attempted to isolate me socially. She had offered bribes to leave Liam, trying to buy her desired control. I had refused each time, knowing that walking away would be surrender, would give her the power she craved. Now it seemed she had grown impatient. Words were not enough. Politeness was not enough. Subtle manipulation was not enough. The culmination of her envy and obsession manifested in a single lethal act. And she had chosen this moment to execute it. I felt a quiet rage settle over me. Not loud, not screaming, not visible. Just cold determination. If she thought this day would be hers to ruin, she was mistaken. I had learned to survive, to read people, to anticipate their worst intentions. Years of careful observation, patience, and restraint had led to this moment. And now I could act. She clinked her glass against another, raising it in a practiced toast to family and new beginnings. Her smile was flawless, her posture impeccable, yet there was a tension beneath it that she could not hide. I felt a pulse of fear, not for myself, but for the spectacle that was about to unravel in front of everyone. The elegance of the reception, the carefully arranged flowers, the music, and the flashing cameras. All of it could become a stage for chaos. I moved subtly, my actions hidden within the gestures of a bride adjusting her gown and veil. The glasses were in place. The poisoned liquid, intended for me, now returned to its origin. I exhaled softly, feeling the sharp satisfaction of anticipation and dread entwined. She would not see it coming. She had never imagined me capable of foresight or patience. Guests laughed, oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. Liam smiled at me across the table, entirely unaware of the hidden danger in proximity. I wanted to warn him, to whisper the truth, but I knew it would not matter until the right moment. Panic or interference would only give her a chance to regain control. This required silence, observation, patience. I watched her lift the glass to her lips, the elegant arc of her hand precise. Her expression was calm, practiced, unaware that her plan was collapsing in the same hands that had survived it. Time seemed to slow, stretching each second to feel eternal. My mind catalogued the possibilities, the consequences, the reactions of everyone present once the inevitable occurred. And then it happened. Her expression faltered. A subtle twitch, almost imperceptible. She coughed once. A small sharp sound that cut through the murmurs of the guests. The glass slipped slightly from her fingers. I held my breath, watching every motion, every change in her posture, every reaction in the room. No one else noticed, of course. Only I could see it, the plan that had been years in the making collapsing before my eyes. I did not move. I could not. I simply watched as Eleanor staggered, a faint tremor in her hand, her smile cracking. The toast continued around her, unaware of the unfolding reality. I realized with a cold certainty that years of manipulation, exclusion, and quiet malice were reaching their end. The moment was delicate, fragile, dangerous. One wrong move could escalate everything, ruin the reception, destroy lives. And yet, a strange satisfaction settled in my chest. This was the reckoning she had written for me. Now it would unfold in her own hands. The music swelled, laughter echoed, cameras flashed, and she lowered her glass, still attempting composure. But the tension in her shoulders, the slight paleness creeping over her skin, revealed the truth she had tried to hide. I understood finally that the battle was no longer subtle. It was public. It was immediate. And it would be irreversible. I forced a small, polite smile, invisible to everyone else, a mask of innocence and grace. The world saw a bride adjusting her veil, preparing for another toast. The truth, however, waited beneath the surface, ready to reveal itself in the coming moments. And then, as she blinked rapidly, trying to maintain composure, I felt the full weight of what had just begun. Years of quiet terror, subtle cruelty, and relentless control had led to this moment. A wedding designed to celebrate love had become the stage for revelation, justice, and chaos. I could only watch, silently, knowing that the consequences of her actions were about to unfold in ways no one could anticipate. And in that heartbeat, suspended between celebration and calamity, I realized the simple truth. Some people don't just want to win. They want to destroy. And I had just handed her the ending she had intended for me. The room spun slightly, though I kept my posture steady. Guests laughed, oblivious, while Eleanor's smile flickered for a moment. She raised her hand to steady herself, fingers trembling ever so slightly. I watched her carefully, calculating every subtle movement. The years of manipulation, subtle taunts, and quiet power plays had led to this precise moment. Now, it was unraveling, and she didn't even realize it. Liam leaned closer, holding my hand lightly, unaware of the danger. His eyes were warm, happy, trusting. That trust made my chest tighten, knowing how close we had come to disaster. Eleanor blinked rapidly, trying to mask her weakness. Her grip on the champagne glass was unsteady, but her smile remained practiced. For the first time, the mask slipped just enough to show vulnerability. It wasn't enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it, and I knew the game had changed. The band continued to play, the notes soft and incongruent with the tension in the air. I took a breath and let my hands fall naturally at my sides, careful to appear calm. Every eye in the room was on the couple at the head table, smiling and celebrating, unaware that the smallest misstep could cause chaos. Eleanor coughed again, louder this time, her color paling slightly. She laughed nervously, trying to cover it, and raised her glass as if to take another sip. I held my breath, knowing that every second now counted. One miscalculation, and the night could spiral out of control. I thought back to the countless times she had tried to humiliate me before. The dinners where she commented on my career, the family gatherings she subtly sabotaged, the endless questions meant to undermine me. All of it, every cruel word and act, had led to this moment. And now, the plan she had orchestrated to publicly ruin me had backfired. The first whispers began at the far end of the table. A guest murmured something about Eleanor's uneven steps, another glanced sideways, sensing something unusual. Yet most were still caught up in the celebration. I knew I had to remain composed. Any overt reaction would tip her off, and she was dangerous enough to improvise, to escalate. Her hand shook as she set the glass down, and a faint gurgle escaped her throat. Panic threatened to rise in the room, but I remained still, watching every tiny gesture. Eleanor's eyes darted around, searching for some invisible safety, realizing perhaps that her plan was slipping through her fingers. Liam leaned closer, his voice soft. "Are you okay?" he whispered. I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Just a little nervous," I replied. He believed it, and that trust was my shield. Eleanor's composure was faltering now. The first sign of the chaos she had intended to create for me had instead turned inward. She had spent years calculating, controlling, and manipulating, and the tiniest misstep was unraveling everything. I could see the subtle tremor in her lips as she attempted to smile at the guests. One hand clutched her purse tightly, the other hovering over the table as though it might anchor her. She was realizing, silently and painfully, that she had become the danger she meant for me. The whispers grew louder, a few eyes narrowing with suspicion. The faint scent of alcohol mixed with the unfamiliar sharpness of fear began to mingle in the air. Eleanor's gaze flicked to me, scanning for some outward sign of knowledge. I kept my expression serene, allowing only a subtle inward satisfaction to mock the realization that the first crack in her facade was visible. A waiter approached with a tray of champagne, giving Eleanor a chance to regain composure. She accepted it shakily, barely lifting the glass before setting it back down. Her breath was rapid now, almost imperceptible, but enough that I could hear it. I let my mind wander briefly, recalling the letter she had sent, the threats hidden in polite envelopes, the veiled offers meant to buy my silence. All of it had been carefully catalogued in my mind. Now, each memory lent strength to my calm determination. The music shifted again, slower, more deliberate. Guests swayed, oblivious to the tension beneath the surface. Eleanor attempted to laugh, a faint, hollow sound that barely carried. She caught Liam's gaze, trying to appear normal, and he smiled at her politely, unaware of the danger that lingered just out of reach. Her movements grew more unsteady. I could see her fingers tremble slightly as she gestured toward a guest, a small misstep that could not have gone unnoticed to someone paying close attention. I watched, knowing that one more subtle miscalculation could expose everything she had been hiding. A faint cough erupted from her again, louder this time, drawing a glance from Jonathan and Rachel at the side. Eleanor waved dismissively, but the tremor in her body betrayed the effort. The veneer of control was thinning, revealing the true state of the woman who had spent years plotting against me. Time seemed to stretch, each second elongated by the quiet anticipation of disaster. I remained poised, hands lightly resting on the table, giving nothing away. The contrast between my calm and her unraveling composure was stark, almost cinematic in its clarity. I caught a glimpse of Harper, standing nearby, her expression curious, slightly concerned. I gave her a subtle nod, a silent assurance that everything was under control. No one else could understand the depth of danger that had passed unnoticed moments ago. Eleanor's breath hitched, her hand gripping the glass as though it might save her. The subtle tremors ran through her shoulders and neck, betraying the calculated mask she had spent years perfecting. Her eyes flicked toward mine briefly, searching for recognition, for evidence that her secret was discovered. I smiled faintly, calm, unreadable, letting her wonder how much I knew. The whispers began to ripple further, a few more guests noticing something unusual. Eleanor's composure cracked just enough to make them glance sideways. She clutched her purse more tightly, a gesture that did not go unnoticed. Her plan, meticulously crafted, was faltering, and the first public signs of chaos were surfacing. A sudden wave of dizziness passed over her, her hand dropping slightly as the champagne threatened to spill. The subtle tremor was enough to draw a gasp from a nearby guest, and for the first time, the attention shifted however slightly, toward Eleanor rather than the celebration. I remained seated, calm, a quiet witness to the unraveling of years of manipulation. Every subtle tremor, every shallow breath, every faltering step marked the first visible cracks in the facade Eleanor had so carefully constructed. The music played on, the guests remained mostly unaware, and yet the stage was set. The first threads of her carefully woven plan were unraveling, and the consequences would soon follow in ways no one could anticipate. And then, in a heartbeat, her expression changed entirely, a flicker of realization that she had underestimated me. Her eyes widened slightly, her lips parting in a silent gasp, the first acknowledgement that the tide had turned. She was beginning to understand. And I knew the night had only just begun. The air in the reception hall felt heavier now, thick with invisible tension. Music floated lazily from the speakers, but each note felt brittle, like it might shatter at any moment. Guests continued their conversations, sipping champagne, clinking glasses, completely unaware of the storm gathering in plain sight. I could feel every heartbeat in the room, each one echoing my own nervous anticipation. The seconds stretched longer than they should, each moment pregnant with unspoken danger. Eleanor tried to steady herself, her fingers curling tightly around the stem of her glass. Her composure wavered with every passing heartbeat, but she forced a practiced smile. It was small, delicate, but brittle, like thin porcelain. She had spent years perfecting the art of subtle intimidation, the careful manipulation of expressions, gestures, and words. But now, for the first time, the armor she had worn so flawlessly was cracking, revealing the vulnerability she had always hidden from the world. I watched from the head table, calm, silent, yet acutely aware of every micro-expression. Every twitch of her eyelid, every shallow breath, every tremor in her hand was a signal, a thread unraveling in her carefully constructed narrative. The years of cruel comments, small manipulations, and silent threats had led to this moment. And now, the calculated attack she had planned to humiliate me publicly was collapsing in ways she could not anticipate. Liam, completely oblivious to the danger, leaned closer, murmuring something about the next song. I smiled faintly, nodding, masking the tension that gripped me. He had no idea how close we had come to disaster. His trust, his innocence, made me want to protect him even more fiercely. But I knew that any sudden alarm, any visible reaction from me, could give Eleanor an opportunity to improvise, to regain control. Her eyes darted around the room, subtly scanning, searching for some unseen confirmation of her intentions. She had always been clever, always aware, and yet now she faltered, ever so slightly, her mind racing to assess what had gone wrong. For the first time, the calculation that had guided her actions so meticulously wavered. And I knew that once doubt crept in, the fragile web she had spun for years could no longer sustain itself. The first murmurs began among the guests. A few noticed her uneven movements, the slight stagger in her step, the faint tremor in her hands. Others glanced over, sensing something was off, though they could not yet place what it was. The laughter and conversation continued, masking the tension, but the undercurrent of suspicion was spreading like a ripple across a still pond. I kept my expression serene, giving nothing away, every movement natural, every glance casual. I allowed the calm mask to settle over me, concealing the storm that had settled in my chest. Every second that passed, every subtle crack in Eleanor's poise, reinforced the inevitability of what was about to unfold. She had underestimated my ability to observe, to anticipate, to act without hesitation. Eleanor's hand shook slightly as she raised the glass again, attempting to toast the room once more. The tremor betrayed her effort to regain control, and a few more guests' eyes shifted toward her. She realized something was wrong, though she could not yet identify the source. A shadow of fear crossed her face, fleeting but unmistakable. I remembered the letters she had sent, the subtle barbs meant to isolate me from Liam, the attempts to erode my confidence, my place in his life. Each memory lent me strength now. I understood her patterns, her tactics, her obsessions. And I knew with absolute clarity that her plan had failed in the most spectacular way. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne, and Eleanor took a glass almost reflexively, as though the action might restore her composure. She raised it to her lips, paused, then lowered it slowly, her eyes wide with realization that something had gone terribly wrong. The liquid meant to ruin me now posed the threat to her own well-being. The music changed again, a slower haunting melody that seemed to echo the tension in the room. Guests swayed gently, still unaware, while I observed Eleanor's every reaction. The subtle flush creeping over her skin, the tremor in her fingers, the brief faltering of her smile, it was all evidence of her unraveling plan. Harper, standing close to me, glanced at Eleanor with concern. I gave her a subtle nod, my eyes locking with hers briefly. She understood without words, the unspoken acknowledgement of what had just occurred. The tension between calm observation and impending chaos was palpable, and Harper's presence grounded me, reminding me that I was not alone in witnessing this fragile moment. Eleanor's movements became more erratic. She coughed sharply, drawing a few stares, though she waved them off quickly. Her eyes flicked toward me again, searching for some hint of knowledge, some indication that I had seen the truth. I smiled faintly, unreadable, letting her imagine the scope of my awareness. The whispers among guests grew louder, subtle yet noticeable. Eyes darted between Eleanor and me, a few noting the difference in composure. The tension was spreading, like smoke seeping into a crowded room, unnoticed by most but sensed by those attuned to the smallest shifts. Jonathan and Rachel exchanged worried glances, sensing that something was amiss. Eleanor tried to maintain her veneer of control, but the tremor in her hand, the rapid blinking, the subtle shift in posture, all betrayed her effort. The carefully constructed narrative she had built over years was collapsing, and the first public signs of that collapse were beginning to emerge. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every gaze, every murmur, every subtle movement in the room. The storm she had intended to unleash on me had turned inward, consuming her instead. I felt a quiet satisfaction, tempered by the knowledge that one misstep now could reignite chaos. Her breathing became more rapid, her lips parting as though to speak, though no words came. She reached instinctively for her purse, clutching it as though it could anchor her to some sense of safety. The guests, oblivious, continued their conversations, but the undercurrent of suspicion was growing stronger. I realized that Eleanor was beginning to understand the situation fully, the reversal of her plan, the exposure of her intentions. Her eyes widened slightly, scanning the room, and I knew the moment of reckoning was approaching. A subtle cough escaped her again, louder this time, drawing attention from nearby guests. For the first time, she was visibly struggling to maintain the composure that had defined her for years. Every movement, every falter, was a piece of evidence that could no longer be hidden. Time stretched, every second drawing the room closer to the inevitable reveal. I remained poised, observing, calculating, letting the tension build. The first cracks had formed, and soon, the facade Eleanor had perfected for years would shatter completely. And in that suspended heartbeat, I understood that the night was far from over. The threads of deception were unraveling, and the consequences would ripple through the room in ways no one could yet anticipate. Her gaze met mine one last time, a flicker of fear passing through her eyes, the first silent acknowledgement that she had underestimated me. The evening had only just begun. The chandeliers cast golden light across the room, but it felt heavy now, almost suffocating. Eleanor's skin was paler, a subtle gray creeping along her jawline. She tried to smile at a passing guest, but the tremor in her hand betrayed the effort. Every movement was deliberate, every breath a struggle masked by elegance. I sat at the head table, feigning calm, but my mind raced. I had anticipated her attack, neutralized it, and yet the suspense was unbearable. The room continued to celebrate, blissfully unaware of the silent war unfolding inches from their eyes. Liam laughed at something Harper whispered, completely unaware of the danger he had just escaped. I glanced at him, feeling a protective surge of fear mixed with relief. His innocence and trust made my determination sharpen. No one would ever manipulate or harm him because of her again. Eleanor shifted her weight, trying to appear steady. Her steps were uneven as she moved toward the buffet, pretending to engage with guests. I noticed subtle lines forming on her forehead, the slight quiver in her lips. Her plan was failing, and the panic beneath the surface was growing. A waiter passed with hors d'oeuvres, and she reached for one, but her hand shook violently, causing a slight spill. Gasps rippled through the guests near her, though they dismissed it as clumsiness. I knew better. Every subtle sign spoke volumes, revealing a woman losing control, a facade crumbling beneath the weight of her own design. I thought back to the 2 years of subtle war she had waged against me. The backhanded compliments, the isolating comments, the covert attempts to drive a wedge between Liam and me. Every calculated move now seemed like a whisper compared to the chaos her own actions were about to unleash. She raised her glass again, attempting a toast, but the trembling was too pronounced. Her eyes flickered toward me, a mixture of fear and disbelief. She had believed she was untouchable, that her careful plotting would succeed without consequence. I offered her nothing but calm, a mask that concealed the quiet satisfaction that surged within me. Guests began to notice the slightest disturbances. A sudden pause, a sharp intake of breath, a cough that didn't match the melody of the room. Eleanor's composure wavered, though most people still saw only a poised, slightly awkward woman. To me, every small falter was a story, a signal of victory hidden in plain sight. I felt Hopper's gaze on me. She didn't need to speak. Her expression said it all. She understood the gravity of the moment, the reversal of the trap that had been set for me. Together, we observed Eleanor's every move, silent witnesses to the crumbling of her meticulously constructed plan. Liam finally noticed something strange. His brow furrowed slightly as he glanced at Eleanor, confusion and concern flickering across his face. He leaned closer to me. Is she okay?" he murmured. I nodded, offering only a calm smile. "Probably just nerves," I said, though my mind catalogued every tremor, every falter, every indication that she was unraveling. Eleanor's breathing became more erratic. She coughed sharply again, this time loud enough to draw more attention. A few guests turned, concern evident in their expressions. She waved them off, trying to appear composed, but the effort was transparent to anyone paying attention. I could see the calculation in her eyes, the silent panic. She was realizing finally that her plan had failed spectacularly. The poison intended for me was now a threat to her own body, her actions reversing the damage she had meticulously orchestrated. Her lips parted, as if to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her hand shook violently as she clutched the glass, tipping it slightly. The liquid inside sloshed perilously close to spilling. I felt a cold thrill, knowing that her years of control were slipping through her fingers, piece by piece. Jonathan and Rachel noticed the change too, subtle as it was. Their concern grew, eyes darting between Eleanor and me. Liam's unease deepened, sensing that something beyond the obvious had shifted. The tension in the room, invisible yet palpable, had begun to ripple outward. I remained seated, calm, observing, calculating. Every gasp, every pause, every subtle tremor was a step closer to the truth being revealed. I had predicted this escalation, prepared for it, yet the thrill of anticipation coursed through me like electricity. Eleanor moved toward a chair, her steps unsteady, the faintest sheen of sweat forming along her hairline. She gripped the table to steady herself, lips pressed tight as if to force control over the chaos. It was no longer subtle. The guests might not understand, but the danger was visible to those who knew what to watch for. I could see the panic in her eyes, the silent acknowledgement that she had underestimated me, underestimated the strength and patience it took to survive her years of cruelty. Her plan had turned against her, and she was powerless to stop the unraveling. A waiter passed again, and she reached mechanically for a napkin, spilling a few crumbs in the process. The small errors accumulated, each unnoticed by the majority of guests, but every falter was a revelation. Each movement, a statement of her collapse. I caught Liam's gaze briefly, a flicker of concern mixed with confusion. I whispered, "She'll be fine," though it was a lie designed to preserve calm. In reality, the poison had already taken its subtle effect, her body responding in ways that would soon become undeniable. Eleanor's eyes met mine across the room. The realization in them was stark, silent, and frightening. She had believed herself untouchable, and now she understood that the tables had turned entirely. Her carefully constructed world of control was collapsing, every hidden thread exposed to the light. Guests began to murmur more noticeably. Subtle glances exchanged. The first cracks in the elegant facade of celebration had begun to show. Eleanor's composure faltered further, each step growing more labored, each breath more shallow. I sat, calm and poised, watching the unraveling with careful attention. The poison was a slow whisper, subtle but relentless, revealing the true vulnerability of a woman who had once seemed invincible. Her panic was internal, invisible to most, but I saw it entirely. The music shifted again, slow and somber, perfectly accompanying the tension building in the room. Eleanor's trembling hand reached for the edge of the table, fingers curling as if holding on for dear life. She understood, finally, the scope of her miscalculation. And in that moment, I realized the night was far from over. The storm had begun, and it would sweep through the room with consequences no one could yet foresee. Her eyes met mine once more, wide with fear and disbelief, and I knew the reckoning had only just begun. The music continued, soft and flowing, but the room's energy had shifted. Something intangible hummed beneath the surface, a tension that drew subtle attention. Guests laughed and clinked glasses, unaware that the perfect evening was beginning to fracture. Eleanor's movements grew more unsteady. She reached for her chair, gripping it tightly, knuckles white. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she tried to appear composed, but the subtle tremors betrayed the effort. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, a rhythm too fast to be ignored. I remained seated, calm, observing, every detail recorded in my mind. Each falter, each twitch, Each small tremor revealed more about her unraveling plan. She had underestimated my awareness, my patience, and my ability to act without drawing attention. Now, the first real cracks in her facade were emerging. Liam finally noticed the subtle change in her posture. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked quietly, concern lacing his tone. Eleanor's gaze flicked toward him, panic briefly replacing her carefully curated expression. She forced a tight smile and nodded, but her unsteady posture and quickened breathing told the story she could not conceal. Guests nearby started to murmur softly. A few glanced over, puzzled, noticing the small inconsistencies in Eleanor's movements. The laughter continued, but a few eyes lingered, curiosity growing. The fragile veneer of normalcy was beginning to chip. Eleanor's hand trembled violently as she reached for a glass of water. She gripped it tightly, lifting it slowly, only to spill a few drops onto the polished surface. The faint sound drew attention, and a guest leaned closer, concerned. Eleanor waved them off, her smile strained, but the panic in her eyes could not be hidden entirely. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. Her plan had always been meticulous, intended to humiliate and harm me without anyone suspecting a thing. Now, the situation had reversed. The poison meant for me was affecting her subtly, slowly, but surely. Her carefully constructed control was slipping from her grasp. Harper glanced at me, eyes wide, understanding without words. We had been silent witnesses to Eleanor's quiet war against me for years, and now the first real signs of her downfall were visible. She had underestimated the depth of my observation, the precision of my patience. Liam moved closer, his concern growing. "Mom, really, are you okay?" he asked again, his brow furrowed. Eleanor's gaze shifted nervously between us, trying to regain composure, but the tremor in her hands and her shallow breathing betrayed her. The first hints of real panic were surfacing. Jonathan and Rachel noticed too, exchanging uneasy glances. They whispered softly, glancing toward Eleanor, their concern growing. The subtle signs, once invisible, were now detectable by those paying attention. The atmosphere of perfect celebration was beginning to unravel, and the whispers among guests became more noticeable. Eleanor coughed sharply, drawing even more attention. She waved it off quickly, but the sound carried. Guests turned slightly, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. Her meticulously planned mask of control was failing in plain sight, yet she clung to the remnants of it desperately. I observed her carefully, noting the patterns in her faltering movements. Each tremor, each uneven step, each subtle gasp was a thread in the unraveling of years of manipulation. The poison's slow effect was amplifying the chaos she had tried to orchestrate against me. The band played a soft, haunting melody, almost mirroring the tension in the room. The guests swayed gently, unaware, while I catalogued every motion, every reaction. Eleanor's gaze met mine briefly, wide with silent fear and disbelief. For the first time, she understood that her plan had failed spectacularly. Her trembling hand knocked over a small plate, and the faint clatter drew a few more stares. She waved it off quickly, forcing her posture upright, but the panic in her eyes grew with each passing moment. The poison was subtle, slow, but its effects were unmistakable to anyone who noticed. I could see the calculation in her mind, the frantic effort to regain control, the sudden realization that she had underestimated the situation. Every movement betrayed desperation. A woman who had spent years plotting now facing the consequences of her own actions. Liam's brow furrowed further, his trust shaken slightly as he processed the subtle signs. "Mom, something's wrong," he said quietly. Eleanor's eyes darted toward him, her forced composure faltering. The subtle tremors became impossible to hide. Guests now whispered more openly, glancing toward Eleanor. The first real sense of alarm began to ripple through the room. The perfect reception, the carefully arranged celebration, was cracking under the weight of hidden danger. Eleanor stumbled slightly, gripping the edge of the table. Her breathing grew rapid, shallow, erratic. Panic finally seeped fully into her expression, though she still attempted a strained smile for the guests. Her carefully curated mask of control had failed completely. I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction, tempered by the tension of what might happen next. Her plan to harm me had not only failed but now threatened her own safety. The delicate balance of composure she had relied on for years was gone, and the first true chaos of the evening had begun. Her eyes met mine again, wide and filled with silent dread. She knew, finally, that her actions had turned against her. The night was far from over, and the consequences of her failure were beginning to ripple through the room in ways no one could yet predict. The room's energy had shifted entirely. The soft hum of music could no longer mask the tension. Guests were starting to notice subtle signs, uneven steps, faltering smiles, quick glances exchanged with concern. What had once seemed like an ordinary wedding reception was now beginning to feel fragile, precarious, as if the slightest touch could shatter it. Eleanor's hands trembled violently. She gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, trying to steady herself. Her breaths came shallow and uneven, a sharp contrast to the elegance she had tried to maintain for years. The subtle gray creeping along her jawline was becoming more pronounced. Every carefully planned gesture of control now betrayed weakness. I remained seated, outwardly calm, observing her every move. The poison she had meant for me was taking its slow, relentless toll. Each twitch, each falter, each gasp became a testament to her miscalculation. She had underestimated me, underestimated the patience, foresight, and quiet strength that had allowed me to survive her years of subtle torment. Liam's concern deepened. He had noticed the subtle differences in his mother's movements, the unsteady way she held herself. "Mom, are you sure you're okay?" he asked again, his voice laced with genuine worry. Eleanor's gaze shifted to him, panic flickering in her eyes. She forced a strained smile, but it did little to hide the tremors overtaking her hands. Guests started to whisper more openly. A few had noticed the faltering steps, the uneven posture, the pale complexion, and the shaking hands. Curiosity and concern rippled through the room, small but growing. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the polite smiles could no longer fully mask the rising tension. Eleanor's composure continued to deteriorate. She coughed, louder this time, drawing even more attention. A few guests glanced toward her directly, their expressions questioning. She waved them off hastily, attempting to appear in control, but the effort was transparent. The carefully constructed mask of dominance she had worn for years was crumbling before my eyes. I could see the calculation in her expression. She realized finally that her plan had failed and that her own actions were backfiring. The poison she had used to target me now posed a subtle but undeniable threat to her own health. Her subtle attempts to regain control only highlighted her increasing panic. Harper's eyes met mine briefly. She understood without words, sensing the growing chaos. Years of quiet observation, of subtle preparation, were coming to fruition now. Every tremor, every falter, every shallow breath from Eleanor revealed the truth hidden beneath the polished exterior she presented to the world. Liam moved closer to me. Concern etched across his face. "Something's not right," he whispered, almost to himself. He wasn't wrong. Eleanor's body language, her faltering gestures, and the subtle discoloration of her skin all spoke of danger. The room's fragile calm had started to crack, and the first threads of real panic were forming among the guests. Eleanor's movements became more erratic. She tried to lift her glass, but her hand shook violently, spilling a few drops onto the table. A faint gasp escaped a nearby guest, drawing a few more eyes toward her. She waved them off, forcing her posture upright, but the panic in her eyes betrayed every effort. I noticed the small signs, the subtle tremors that indicated the poison was taking effect. Her plan had completely reversed, turning her own intentions against her. She was struggling to maintain composure, failing with every passing second. The contrast between her unraveling and my calm focus was stark. Jonathan and Rachel exchanged concerned glances, their unease growing as they noticed Eleanor's faltering movements. Their whispers spread quietly, barely audible, but enough to ripple through the room. Guests began to notice, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others leaning toward each other, trying to understand the sudden tension. Eleanor coughed again, sharp and uncontrolled. She waved dismissively, but the trembling in her hand and the uneven rise and fall of her chest betrayed the effort. The first real signs of visible danger were emerging, and even those who had been oblivious were beginning to sense something amiss. I remained poised, hands resting lightly on the table, every movement natural. The thrill of anticipation surged quietly within me. The night had transformed from a celebration to a stage where the consequences of deception and obsession would reveal themselves fully. Her gaze locked on mine across the table. Fear, disbelief, and silent recognition filled her eyes. She had realized the depth of her failure and the reversal of her own plot. The first cracks in the illusion of control she had maintained for years were now fully visible. The whispers among the guests were louder now, more noticeable. Some began to glance at Liam, uncertain, while others continued to watch Eleanor with growing concern. The once perfect reception was shifting into a scene of rising panic, subtle but undeniable. Eleanor's trembling increased. Her grip on the table faltered slightly, her body swaying as she attempted to steady herself. Breath came in short, rapid bursts, each inhalation sharper than the last. Her plan had not only failed, it was collapsing in front of everyone, exposing her vulnerability completely. I watched, silent, noting every reaction, every subtle shift in the room. The poison's effect was slow, invisible to most, but entirely apparent in Eleanor's faltering movements. She had underestimated me, underestimated the patience, observation, and control I possessed. And in that suspended moment, the realization hit her fully. She had not only failed to harm me, she was now the one under threat, her years of subtle control dissolving in the light of her own miscalculation. The first true panic among the guests was forming. Eyes shifted nervously, whispers grew, and attention subtly began to center on Eleanor. The carefully orchestrated image of perfection had started to fracture, and the night's chaos was quietly beginning to spread. Her gaze met mine one last time, wide with fear and disbelief. She understood now entirely that the night had turned against her. And I knew the reckoning was only beginning. The room felt different now, the earlier warmth and cheer replaced with a subtle tension that clung to every surface. Music played softly, but the notes seemed hollow, almost brittle against the invisible weight pressing down on the reception. Guests had begun to notice small anomalies. Eleanor's faltering steps, her pale skin, the slight trembling of her hands. Conversations hushed, laughter waned, and eyes flicked toward her with growing concern. Eleanor gripped the edge of the table as if it were her only anchor. Her breaths came in sharp, uneven bursts, betraying the control she had fought so hard to maintain. For the first time, the polished, untouchable persona she had built over years was cracking in plain sight. I remained seated, outwardly calm, observing her every move. Years of subtle manipulation had led to this moment, but she had underestimated my patience, my awareness, and my ability to act without revealing my knowledge. Every tremor, every uneven step, every falter in her voice was a thread unraveling in the web she had woven. Liam's brow furrowed as he glanced toward his mother. "Mom, seriously, are you okay?" His tone was low, hesitant, filled with genuine concern. Eleanor's gaze darted toward him, panic flickering behind the carefully constructed mask. She forced a tight smile, but it wavered almost immediately, her trembling hands betraying the effort. The whispers among the guests grew louder. A few more eyes turned toward Eleanor, noticing the uneven posture, the shallow breathing, the subtle signs of distress. The perfect reception was beginning to fracture, the illusion of calm unraveling piece by piece. Eleanor attempted to move toward her seat, but her steps were unsteady. She clutched a purse, her knuckles white, and her lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. Each falter drew more attention, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The poison she had intended for me had now become a slow, insidious weapon against herself. I felt Hopper's gaze on me. She didn't need words to communicate. Her expression conveyed everything. Years of quiet observation, of planning, of understanding Eleanor's patterns, had led to this precise moment. And now, the first true confrontation was about to unfold. Liam's concern deepened. "Mom, you don't look well," he said, his voice rising slightly as fear crept in. Eleanor's eyes widened, realizing that her facade was failing not only for the guests but for the one person she had counted on to remain unaware. Panic surged visibly across her face. A cough escaped her, sharper this time, drawing several more glances from nearby guests. She waved dismissively, trying to maintain control, but the trembling in her hands, the shallow uneven breaths, and the subtle gray along her jawline could not be concealed. The first real alarm had begun to ripple through the room. Jonathan and Rachel exchanged worried looks, whispering quietly to each other. The subtle signs that had been invisible at first were now undeniable. Guests began shifting uneasily, glancing toward Eleanor and then at each other, trying to reconcile the discrepancy between the perfect reception and the visible faltering of the matriarch. Eleanor's gaze found mine, wide with panic and disbelief. She had underestimated me, underestimated the patience, observation, and strength I had cultivated over years of subtle attacks. Her plan had failed, and the consequences were now fully visible, threatening to expose her vulnerability to everyone in the room. Her trembling intensified. She reached for her glass, spilling a few drops onto the table. Gasps escaped quietly from nearby guests, while others leaned closer, concern etched on their faces. The slow effects of the poison were escalating, turning the calculated elegance she had relied on into visible chaos. I observed her every movement, noting the subtle patterns, the twitch of her eyelid, the faltering posture, the uneven breathing. Each detail confirmed what I had anticipated. Her years of manipulation had finally met their undoing, and the first confrontation with reality was inevitable. Liam's gaze hardened as he started connecting the dots. Subtle inconsistencies between her behavior and the poised matriarch he thought he knew. "Mom, something's very wrong," he said, his voice firmer this time. Eleanor froze, panic flooding her eyes. She had believed herself untouchable, yet here she was, exposed, struggling to maintain composure in front of the very people she had sought to control. The room was tense now, whispers spreading, guests shifting uneasily in their seats. The perfect celebration had transformed into a stage for the unraveling of hidden malice. Every falter, every trembling motion of Eleanor's body drew more attention, setting the stage for the first confrontation that would reveal the truth. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She clutched the edge of the table, swaying slightly, her breaths rapid and shallow. Her eyes locked with mine, filled with silent recognition and disbelief. She had miscalculated, and the consequences were unfolding far beyond her control. The first guests began to lean in, curiosity and concern evident. Eleanor's trembling grew more pronounced. The subtle gray of her skin deepened, and her unsteady stance was now impossible to ignore. Panic, silent but palpable, had begun to radiate from her. And in that suspended moment, I realized that the night had fully shifted. The carefully orchestrated elegance she had relied on for years was gone. The first confrontation had begun, and the reckoning she had long avoided was now unavoidable. Eleanor's eyes met mine one final time, wide with fear and disbelief. She understood completely that her plan had not only failed but that the truth was now visible to everyone. The stage was set, the audience aware, and the first true confrontation was underway. The music felt distant now, like a fragile echo against the rising tension in the room. Conversations had slowed, the polite laughter fading into hushed murmurs. Guests glanced around nervously, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Eleanor's steps faltered. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself. Her skin had grown paler, the subtle gray along her jawline spreading further. Tremors ran through her hands, fingers clutching uselessly at the tablecloth. Each falter drew eyes toward her, a ripple of unease moving across the guests. I remained calm, seated, observing every subtle movement. Each twitch, each uneven breath, each small misstep confirmed the slow, insidious effect of the poison she had intended for me. Her carefully crafted plan had backfired spectacularly, and now the consequences were undeniable. Liam's concern became panic. He moved closer, voice low but urgent. "Mom, sit down, you don't look well." Eleanor's eyes met his briefly, wide with fear. She shook her head subtly, attempting to maintain composure, but her movements were clumsy, uncoordinated. Panic rippled across her features, faint beads of sweat forming on her forehead. Guests were now openly whispering. Some leaned forward, craning their necks to see what was happening. The previously perfect reception was fracturing, subtle tension now visible, threading through the room like electricity. Eleanor's hand shook violently as she tried to raise her glass to her lips. A few drops spilled onto the table. Gasps spread quietly but rapidly. A guest whispered, "Is she okay?" Others nodded, uncertain, their attention drawn fully to her faltering composure. Harper's eyes found mine again. No words were necessary. She understood the stakes. The danger had shifted entirely to Eleanor. Years of calculated manipulation were unraveling, and the first truly visible signs of chaos were spreading among the guests. Eleanor swayed, grabbing the back of a chair for support. Her breaths were shallow and rapid, her pulse visible in the delicate veins of her neck. She coughed sharply, her voice hoarse, and a few guests began murmuring, leaning closer with worry. Liam's face had drained of color. His eyes darted between me and his mother, realization dawning. "Emily, something's wrong," he said quietly but firmly. His tone carried authority, concern, and disbelief. Eleanor's gaze met his for a fraction of a second, panic flashing in recognition that her plan had completely failed. Jonathan and Rachel moved slightly, glancing between each other with increasing unease. Subtle chaos was spreading. The initial murmurs now a quiet hum of alarm. The perfectly orchestrated reception had begun to unravel in the most public way imaginable. Eleanor's hands shook uncontrollably now. She attempted to lift herself from the chair, but her legs wobbled beneath her. A sharp cough escaped her lips, drawing the first audible gasp from the guests. The poison's effect was accelerating, and the consequences were visible to all. I remained seated, calm, masking the quiet satisfaction that surged within me. Every subtle gesture, every tremor, every shallow breath told a story of failure, exposure, and reversal. Her carefully maintained image of control had crumbled entirely. The room's atmosphere thickened. Guests leaned forward, whispering in concern. The music's soft strains now felt hollow, disconnected from the visible tension that had taken root. Eleanor's trembling grew more pronounced, each step toward the table unsteady, each breath shallow and ragged. Liam finally stood, moving to support her. "Mom, sit down. You're going to fall." Eleanor's hand grasped his arm weakly, her eyes wide, panic replacing every ounce of composure. She had lost the power she had relied upon for so long. A few guests began standing, murmuring among themselves, sensing the danger. The whispers grew louder, curiosity and alarm mingling as Eleanor swayed dangerously. Her plan had not only failed but had placed her squarely in the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Eleanor's gaze met mine one final time, wide, desperate, and panicked. She had underestimated me, underestimated the patience and awareness that had allowed me to counter her years of manipulation. The slow poison of her own making was turning inward, and the night was about to reveal the full consequences. And then, with a subtle but undeniable tremor, she collapsed into the chair. The room's polite murmurs transformed into audible gasps. Chairs scraped, whispers escalated, and a few guests moved closer in alarm. The first truly visible chaos had arrived. The stage was set. The audience's attention, now fully captured, witnessed the unraveling of deception, manipulation, and malice. Eleanor, once untouchable, was exposed, vulnerable, and defeated. Liam supported her, his eyes wide with shock, fear, and dawning understanding. "Mom, what happened?" he whispered urgently, his voice carrying across the hushed room. Her lips parted slightly, trembling, unable to form words. She had no defense, no plan, no mask. The poison, the years of scheming, and the reversal of her intentions had culminated in this moment. I remained poised, observing, knowing that the night's true reckoning was only beginning. The whispers had grown into a low hum, the guests' concern evident, and the first major confrontation had fully unfolded before their eyes. Eleanor's eyes met mine once more, filled with disbelief and fear. She had lost control, and the consequences of her actions were now undeniable. The room was quiet now, the music forgotten, replaced by a tense hum of concern. Guests whispered nervously, exchanging glances. Eleanor sat slumped in her chair, her body trembling, breath shallow and rapid. The poison's effect was undeniable. Liam knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Mom, what did you do?" he whispered urgently. Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came. Her carefully maintained composure was gone, replaced by raw panic. I remained seated, calm and composed, watching the room, observing every subtle detail. The chaos that had begun to ripple outward was now fully visible. Guests leaned forward, murmuring, their curiosity growing as the first hints of evidence emerged. A waiter stepped cautiously forward, holding a small tray. One of the glasses Eleanor had reached for earlier had a faint residue at the bottom. I noticed it immediately. Tiny, almost invisible, but enough to hint at what had been intended. My heart quickened, knowing the truth would soon be undeniable. Hopper's eyes found mine. She understood instantly. The subtle signs, the trembling, the faltering movements, the uneven breaths, all pointed to a deliberate act, reversed upon its creator. We had known it was coming, but now the first tangible evidence was emerging. Guests began to murmur more openly. Some glanced at Eleanor's hands, noting the residue on the glass. Others whispered about the sudden collapse, the faltering steps, the faint gray on her skin. The illusion of a perfect evening had fully shattered. Liam's brow furrowed, suspicion and understanding dawning. Mom, this isn't an accident, is it? He asked, voice low but sharp with shock. Eleanor's eyes widened, panic overtaking every thought. She realized fully that her plot had failed spectacularly and that the truth was now visible. A few guests began examining the small glass and the nearby tray, murmuring quietly about what they saw. Jonathan and Rachel exchanged glances, their concern growing as the implications of the evidence became clear. Eleanor's years of manipulation, subtle cruelty, and attempts to humiliate were now on the brink of exposure. Eleanor tried to rise, her body trembling violently, but Liam's firm hand held her in place. Sit down. You're making it worse, he said, his voice steady but urgent. The fear in his eyes mirrored the dawning realization of betrayal. I observed every reaction, noting the subtle fear creeping into Eleanor's eyes. The panic that had been invisible to most guests was now undeniable, reinforced by the emerging evidence. She had underestimated everyone. Her son, the guests, and me. The faint vial I had seen earlier, hidden in her purse, now sat exposed on the table as a consequence of the spill. A few guests noticed it, pointing and whispering, their expressions filled with alarm and confusion. The subtle chaos had escalated into something tangible, undeniable, and public. Liam's expression hardened. Mom, you've crossed a line. This is serious, he said, his voice low but firm. Eleanor's gaze darted nervously between him and me. She had no explanation, no mask to hide behind, and the panic in her eyes was undeniable. Guests were now moving cautiously, some standing, some whispering to one another. The initial murmurs of concern had turned into quiet acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Eleanor's carefully orchestrated facade had completely fallen apart. Harper leaned toward me, whispering softly. They're noticing. The evidence is clear. I nodded, my calm mask hiding the anticipation that surged beneath. The slow, insidious plan that Eleanor had crafted for years had turned fully against her. Eleanor's lips trembled. She tried to speak, but her voice was hoarse, weak, and broken. The panic and fear she had hidden for so long were now fully exposed. Every falter, every tremor, every shallow breath screamed truth to anyone paying attention. Liam stood, supporting her weight, his eyes scanning the room. The guests' whispers grew louder, more insistent. The first undeniable confrontation with reality had begun. The poison, the manipulation, the years of cruelty, all were on the verge of exposure. Her gaze met mine once more, wide with fear and disbelief. She understood fully that the night had turned against her. The evidence was now visible, undeniable, and the first steps toward accountability had begun. The evening had changed irreversibly. What had started as a celebration had transformed into a quiet, tense revelation of deception, manipulation, and the reckoning that had been inevitable all along. Eleanor's panic deepened. Her hands shook violently, her lips quivered, and the subtle gray of her skin had darkened. The first undeniable exposure of her intentions was complete. And in that moment, I realized that the night's true reckoning had begun. The whispers among the guests had grown louder, threading through the room like electricity. Chairs scraped against the polished floor, and the soft hum of conversation was punctuated by startled gasps. Eleanor's trembling had escalated, every movement shaky, her breaths shallow and quick. The weight of exposure pressed down on her like a tangible force. Liam's eyes were sharp, scanning every detail. Mom, this isn't a joke. You need help, he said, voice steady but urgent. Eleanor's gaze flicked to him, wide with panic. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The carefully maintained mask she had worn for years was gone, shattered by the consequences of her actions. Guests now shifted uneasily, some standing, some leaning closer to each other, trying to understand the unfolding scene. Jonathan and Rachel exchanged alarmed glances. The initial murmurs had turned into a quiet hum of concern, and everyone's attention was now focused on Eleanor. A security officer, called discreetly by a guest, approached cautiously. His presence was subtle but authoritative, immediately heightening the tension. He glanced at Eleanor, then at Liam, taking in the signs of distress. Ma'am, are you feeling all right? He asked gently. Eleanor's hands shook violently as she clutched the edge of the table. I observed silently, calm on the surface, as the room's energy shifted. Every subtle tremor in Eleanor's body, every shallow breath, every panicked glance, spoke volumes. Her plan had failed, and now the first real intervention was arriving. Liam knelt beside her, supporting her weight. "Mom, look at me. You have to calm down," he urged. Eleanor's eyes darted around the room, panic and disbelief mixing in a silent scream. She realized fully that her deception was exposed and that she was now powerless in front of everyone. The security officer discreetly radioed for medical assistance. Guests continued to whisper, tension growing. The illusion of a perfect wedding had fully unraveled. The first steps toward accountability were underway. A paramedic arrived quietly, approaching Eleanor with caution. She swayed as they reached her, clutching Liam's arm. Her lips trembled, voice weak and hoarse, unable to articulate a coherent explanation. The poison's slow but relentless effect was clear to all who looked closely. Hopper's eyes met mine. No words were needed. The evidence in Eleanor's visible panic spoke for themselves. The years of subtle cruelty, manipulation, and the carefully planned humiliation had now turned against her entirely. Liam's expression hardened as he processed everything. "Mom, this is serious. What you tried, it's unacceptable," he said firmly, supporting her as the paramedics prepared to assist. Eleanor's gaze flicked to me, wide with disbelief and silent pleading. She had miscalculated completely. Guests now openly observed, whispers turning into low murmurs of shock and concern. The first clear signs of her downfall were fully visible. Her carefully constructed image of control had crumbled, and the intervention of authority confirmed that consequences were now unavoidable. Eleanor's trembling worsened. Her hands shook violently as the paramedics guided her toward a chair. She leaned heavily on Liam, breath shallow and ragged. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for some escape, but there was none. Her plan had not only failed, it had placed her completely in the center of scrutiny. I remained calm, seated, watching. Each movement, each gasp, each flicker of fear in Eleanor's eyes confirmed the inevitable. Her years of subtle attacks, manipulation, and cruelty had come full circle, exposing her for the first time in a public, undeniable way. The paramedics checked her pulse and vitals, nodding quietly to each other. Eleanor's panic intensified as she realized there was no hiding, no controlling the situation anymore. The slow unraveling that had begun months ago had reached its climax in front of everyone. Liam's gaze softened slightly, worry still evident, but authority had arrived. The shift from subtle observation to overt intervention marked a turning point. Eleanor was powerless now, her years of scheming rendered useless in the face of visible evidence and professional assessment. Guests continued to whisper, some stepping back, some leaning closer, eyes wide with curiosity and concern. The perfect reception had transformed completely. An intimate celebration had turned into a public confrontation and reckoning. Eleanor's eyes met mine once more, wide, desperate, and filled with disbelief. She understood fully that the night had turned against her. The authorities' presence confirmed that consequences were no longer avoidable. And in that tense, charged moment, the evening's unraveling reached a new, undeniable stage. The room was silent now, save for the quiet hum of concerned whispers. Guests craned their necks, eyes fixed on Eleanor as she sat trembling in her chair, supported by Liam. The elegant facade she had spent years cultivating had completely dissolved. Every tremor, every shallow breath, every faltering gesture told a story she could no longer hide. Liam's voice was steady but filled with quiet fury. "Mom, I trusted you. How could you do this?" His words cut through the tension like a knife. Eleanor's eyes widened, panic overtaking all pretense. She opened her mouth, trying to form a reply, but the words caught in her throat. The paramedics moved with gentle authority, checking her vitals. Eleanor's hands shook violently as she gripped the arm of her chair. The subtle gray in her skin had deepened, her trembling unmistakable. The evidence of her miscalculated plan was now undeniable, and every guest could see it. I remained seated, calm and composed, observing every reaction. The whispers grew louder, a low murmur of shock spreading throughout the room. Years of manipulation, backhanded insults, and subtle cruelty had culminated in this moment, exposed for everyone to witness. Jonathan and Rachel exchanged uneasy glances. I can't believe this is happening," Rachel whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. Guests nodded, some whispering to one another, others staring openly at Eleanor. The perfect reception had shifted into a public reckoning. Liam tightened his grip on Eleanor's arm. "Mom, look at me. You've crossed a line. Do you understand? He said, his tone firm, demanding accountability. Eleanor's eyes flicked to me, wide and desperate, as if pleading silently for help, for a reprieve. But the truth was clear. There was no hiding now. Harper's gaze met mine. Years of observation, patience, and subtle counteraction had led to this moment. Every subtle falter, every tremor, every shallow breath was evidence of Eleanor's failure. The poison intended for me had turned against her, and now the consequences were fully visible. A few guests began moving closer, some whispering questions, others staring openly. The first undeniable realization of her malice and manipulation was spreading, and the murmurs of shock were growing. Eleanor's carefully constructed mask of control had completely disintegrated. Her lips trembled, and she tried to speak again, voice weak and hoarse. I didn't mean, she began, but the words faltered, choked by panic and the tremors overtaking her body. Liam's eyes narrowed, disappointment and shock mingling with anger. Didn't mean? Mom. This was calculated. Don't lie to me, he said sharply. Guests now leaned in, curiosity and concern mingling as they witnessed the unraveling. The first threads of revelation had fully surfaced. Eleanor's years of manipulation, subtle humiliation, and attempts to control were laid bare for everyone present. The small vial that had been hidden in her purse earlier lay exposed on the table. Its presence, combined with her faltering movements and visible panic, left no room for doubt. The evidence was concrete, undeniable, and the room now understood the gravity of the situation. Eleanor's trembling intensified. She gripped Liam's arm tightly, her breaths shallow and rapid. Panic had replaced any semblance of composure, fear overtaking every thought. The carefully constructed world she had maintained for years was collapsing around her. I observed silently, noting every reaction. Every whisper, every gasp, every faltering gaze was part of the story being revealed. The audience had shifted from passive guests to active witnesses of her downfall. Liam's gaze softened slightly, concern still evident, but his voice remained firm. Mom, you've gone too far. This isn't just about appearances anymore. What you tried to do, it's dangerous, he said. Eleanor's eyes widened, filled with disbelief, shame, and fear. Guests began murmuring more openly, some whispering to one another, some moving cautiously to get a better view. The tension in the room was palpable, the perfect reception replaced with a charged atmosphere of exposure and reckoning. Eleanor's hands shook violently as she tried to speak again. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for some escape, but there was none. The full scale of her deception was now visible, undeniable, and undeniable consequences were inevitable. The paramedics prepared to assist her further. Liam's grip remained firm, guiding her carefully, while guests continued to murmur, shock and concern growing. The perfect celebration had transformed into a public unveiling of truth, manipulation, and accountability. Eleanor's eyes met mine one final time, wide with fear, disbelief, and silent pleading. She understood fully now. The night had turned entirely against her, and there was no undoing the exposure that had begun. The first wave of the night's reckoning was complete. The audience had witnessed the collapse of years of manipulation, and the consequences were now unavoidable. The room had transformed completely. The soft laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the music were gone, replaced by a tense, electric quiet. Guests watched, frozen in attention, as Eleanor trembled in her chair, her breath shallow, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Liam remained at her side, supporting her, his face a mixture of anger, disappointment, and protective determination. Mom, this ends tonight, he said firmly, his voice carrying through the quiet room. Eleanor's eyes met his, wide with panic and disbelief. For the first time, she realized that nothing she had done could undo what had been set in motion. I stood, moving closer with deliberate calm, every step measured. Harper followed silently, eyes alert. The small vial that had been hidden earlier now sat on the table, undeniable evidence of Eleanor's intent. Guests murmured quietly, their whispers a low hum of curiosity and concern. Paramedics and the security officer guided Eleanor carefully, checking her vitals while she leaned heavily on Liam. Her attempts to speak were weak, hoarse, and faltering. I didn't mean to, she whispered, voice trembling. Liam's grip tightened slightly. No, Mom, he said sharply. You did mean to. And now, everyone sees the truth. His gaze swept over the room, meeting the curious, shocked, and concerned faces of the guests. Eleanor's carefully maintained facade had crumbled entirely. Evidence was now clear. The poison, the hidden vial, the trembling, the panicked faltering, all pointed to her deliberate intentions. Guests who had been unsure now whispered openly, connecting the dots. The carefully orchestrated celebration had turned into a courtroom of silent witnesses. Eleanor's gaze shifted to me, desperation filling her eyes. Years of manipulation and control had taught her to rely on appearances, but none of that could protect her now. The quiet strength, patience, and calm focus that I had maintained over the years contrasted sharply with her unraveling. Liam stepped back slightly, allowing the paramedics to assist further. "We need to take you to a hospital. And then, you'll have to answer for this," he said firmly. Eleanor's lips quivered, no words forming. The realization of full accountability had finally hit. Guests now began moving cautiously, some whispering to one another, others standing at a respectful distance. The tension was palpable. The room bore witness to a truth years in the making. The exposure of deception, manipulation, and malice. Hopper's eyes met mine. We exchanged a brief, silent acknowledgement. Years of subtle observation, patience, and restraint had led to this moment of justice. Eleanor's downfall was complete, her plans fully reversed upon herself. Eleanor's hands shook violently as she was gently guided toward the waiting vehicle. Breath shallow, eyes wide with fear, she had no mask left to hide behind. The consequences she had tried to avoid were now inevitable. Liam followed closely, his expression resolute yet protective. "Mom, this is the only way," he said softly, guiding her through the room of guests who silently observed, understanding the full gravity of what had occurred. The authorities would soon handle the formal charges. Evidence was undeniable, and Eleanor's calculated actions were now fully documented. The slow unraveling that had begun earlier that evening had reached its inevitable conclusion. I stood quietly, observing, noting every expression in the room. Guests shifted from shock to relief, murmurs of concern giving way to acknowledgement of justice being served. The chaos had ended, replaced with clarity and a sense of resolution. As Eleanor was escorted away, the room slowly exhaled, tension easing slightly. Liam returned to my side, eyes softening. "It's over," he said quietly. I nodded, feeling the weight of the evening lift. The guests began to resume gentle conversation, some lingering in curiosity, others offering quiet reassurances. The celebration, though forever changed, now carried a sense of closure. What had been hidden for years was now exposed, and truth had prevailed. In the quiet aftermath, Liam and I shared a look of understanding and relief. The toxic influence that had haunted our lives was finally gone. Our bond, tested under extreme pressure, had emerged stronger, unshakable. The evening, once poised on the edge of disaster, had transformed into a story of survival, justice, and the quiet triumph of patience and awareness. Eleanor's downfall was complete, the evidence undeniable, and the lessons of accountability clear to all who had witnessed. As we stood together, side by side, the night felt lighter. The chaos had passed, but the strength we had found in one another would endure. Our lives, once threatened by manipulation and malice, now held the promise of peace, unity, and the certainty that truth, patience, and courage always prevail. If this story touched your heart or taught you something valuable, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.